to computing. All right, good. All right. My name is Mort Morehouse, and I'm the host of Talking Smart Conversations with Educators and Philosophers from around the world. This is one of our first YouTube channels. Hopefully it'll be a podcast as well, but I know I can do the YouTube, or at least I think I can. So anyway, we have two guests today. Robert Stack, who is one of the pioneers in helping us understand the nature of case studies, and then has done a lot of work in education and case studies. And Meryl Weiss, who is the head of the Medical Humanities program at Drew University. And they're both actually colleagues at Drew in our Medical Humanities program. So, well, with that, I first of all, I want to just congratulate you on a book that I was sort of late in reading, and that is A Paradigm of Care. I ordered it sometime and I just discovered it on my shelf. And so anyway, it's a very, very fascinating book, and I'm fascinated with the idea of why a paradigm of care, why you chose that way of looking at the nature of care. And whoever wants to start.
You?
I don't remember. Do you?
I do. It was actually, thank you, first of all, Mort, for inviting us to share our work. And I do remember that we actually had a conversation about either using paradigm or, well, we did have some other words, but they really moved to the background now, because this became so important to think of care not just as a virtue or as a psychological trait of people, something that well, only has to do with something normative, so to speak, but we really wanted to highlight that it is a way of being in the world. So it partly refers to paradigm, and I also think, and I think that those were even your words, Bob, that we wanted it to be like something that is encompassing, so that is kind of embracing different kinds of interpretations too. So I think, yeah, that's what I can recall from.
That's my first recollection. The capturing of different phenomena as belonging to the care paradigm.
Yeah, it's a fascinating, and I thought you talked about it very interestingly in the beginning, actually, and the introduction about how that seems to fit. But I was just fascinated by that idea, because I guess my introduction to paradigm comes from Lincoln and Guba talking about the paradigm shift and that kind of language, and I guess So I had that kind of framework, and to think about taking a concept of care and organizing it around a paradigm, I guess, and can you talk a little bit, Meryl, maybe especially about care as it sort of comes out of a European tradition rather than, and then maybe Bob can talk about it from an American perspective.
Yes, of course, because, well, now that I'm also based here in the US, I notice the differences even more between the European and the US based conceptions of care. And so in the Netherlands, I'm affiliated with the Care Ethics Group at the University of Humanistic Studies, as you know. And there we developed care as a form of inquiry, actually. A form of interdisciplinary inquiry where care is happening in everyday practices, but we are also trying to understand what the moral good is in those specific situations of care by looking at these practices. So kind of being a researcher, you just referred to Guba and Lincoln, and their social constructivist approach or a paradigm, if I may like summarize it like that. And I really believe that care builds on that. It's not just social constructivist, but it's really a completely different way of being and knowing in the world. There's, for example, also work, especially in Asia, emerging now on a caring epistemology. So how can we actually know the world through a caring lens? What does it mean if we would put on the caring glasses? But to go back to your question, so in Europe, I think care is also infused by the caring sciences. There are some Scandinavian scholars, and in the UK too, by the way, and in the Netherlands too, of course, but who are really looking into the phenomenology of care. What is caring as a phenomenon? How do people experience more caring practices? And there are French authors. So in France, there is a very strong, I think, theoretical interest in everyday and ordinary. I think Sandra Logier is one of the care ethicists who wrote a beautiful paper many years ago on care ethics as an ethics of the ordinary. And that made me think again of course, Bob's work on case study.
Yes.
Because, yeah. And well, and maybe you can say something about here in the UK, but in the US, but
I think you've done it nicely. I think that your mention of the idea of experience deserves a little more stretch here too. In case studies, we recognize you can have anything as a case, but we're only really interested in people, individual people, sometimes groups of people, as our cases to study. And what do we look at? Not the usual psychological descriptions of those people, but more the stories of their experience. We try to tell stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe to add too, is that there's a very strong American and North American interest in care ethics, because we sometimes say that the mothers of care ethics were Carol Gilligan, Joan Trontel, and nowadays there's a care platform run by Daniel Engster and others. Many others are involved. So I really see the interest in care ethics here as it's growing quickly. The Hastings Center in New York has just hired a postdoc researcher who's an expert on care ethics too. So it's just, everywhere.
Well, it's interesting because, my experience has been just to connect the whole business of caring with social services, sort of, so that we think of those institutions that are caring institutions, and to actually sort of to the exclusion of things like education, which I think, you make a really interesting point about how education is one of the caring enterprises, if you will. But in my mind, maybe it's just my mind, but I'm sort of stuck of an idea of caring still being just a social service, something that's provided by somebody to somebody else rather than a way of being. And so, but maybe we can just even talk a little bit more about that because I think there's a profound shift, and there needs to be in the United States in particular, because it's not something done by someone to another in a exchange kind of mechanism way, which and maybe it's just my narrow perspective, but that's the way I've sort of looked at it in the United States, and with the European perspective being much broader and more mutual in terms of the idea of care.
The United States, in the last half of the previous century, there were a number of developments of education along lines that we more often think of as care disciplines. And the public didn't buy it. They didn't want their children to give up the traditional curriculum, even in small bits, in order to have them taught ethics or behaviors or care. So it hasn't been a practitioner advocacy as much as social scientists and humanitarians who think that education should be more of a reform, especially when at the present time, the students aren't buying the traditional discipline as worthwhile.
Yes. Well, yeah, and again, that brings us back to this area that of your real concern that drew, and that is the whole idea of medical humanities and medical and health humanities, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit in terms of this whole idea of caring, because again, my simple perspective has traditionally placed medicine in a science realm and humanities in a literature and philosophy realm, and the two shall never meet, even though, you know, we know of all kinds of places where hospitals make those efforts, but it's not ingrained in the culture, I from my perspective anyway.
Yes, and maybe care could be a connector here between those realms.
Yes.
I sometimes think, but well, yes, you know, a medical education is education too, and I do see an upcoming interest, and that's not just from the last 3 years, but this goes back more than 10, 15 years for creating spaces in hospitals, in healthcare institutions, elderly care, residential homes, but also in public health settings, to listen better, to learn how to listen better to patients, to listen to their family members, to not just perceive care or medicine as something that physicians or nurses give to in this transaction model that you just mentioned, but that it's really about creating a space for mutuality, belonging, maybe even sometimes, and well, listening, as I mentioned. But but I just wanted to also go back to education a little bit more, because
Yes, please.
yeah, because we contributed to a book recently. It was published in Spanish only, unfortunately, so far, and we wrote about what more caring education could look like, and we also had 2 talks about that in Spain last June at the University of Granada and Santiago de Compostela. There was a conference there where we developed several insights, and I can send you the PDF. We actually have we created a nice flyer with insights on what makes education caring. And one of the insights is, for example, that comparison is bullying.
And you write about that in the Paradigm book too.
Maybe you can say a little bit about that book, because I know that that is also one of your that you brought that up.
Well, I'm not prepared to say more than comparing has been a bad feature of all of public education. The comparing not to a standard or a target, but the comparing to other children. It is a form of bullying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But that same kind of comparing is also present in medical realms. So that is why I had to think of it too, because I mean, clinical trials, for example, they're based. It's statistics that most of I think what doctors now practice is based upon knowledge that's generated there. And to counter that, we have in the medical and health humanities a field that it's kind of subfield that we call narrative medicine. So one of the courses at Drew is on narrative medicine. You are actually currently you're working with Kitana Kopczynski, right?
Yes.
So, and that's where we try to create space for the patient experience, and how to listen to stories and share it. Yeah. So in medical and health.
Yeah, and coming from a background in psychology, that's one of those battles that is, I think, from my perspective, a kind of a losing battle, at least in some psychology departments, because, well, for example, we have at Viterbo, we have a master's and doctoral program in counseling that kind of focuses on alcohol and alcoholism and drug addiction, etc. And they hardly accept any research that is not based on strict experimental control group study. And so all kinds of interesting information that people are beginning to understand about the whole addiction process, etc., ends up to be, if not dismissed, then secondary status. And so, and it's a real detriment in it. And it's hard to turn that I don't know, the direction, I guess. So
yeah, to create space for other types of knowing that really.
Yeah. And I'm really interested in how we, and that's why I like the paradigm idea too, about how we began to make shifts, and that the whole idea of a caring paradigm then includes places for case studies and qualitative studies, and not to the ignoring of those clinical trials. There's a place for that too, but there needs to be upgrading of status, I think, in terms of the value of case studies and the depth of understanding that you get from individual cases and group analysis. And so
it starts on a new book manuscript that is actually about that. So we became curious on how to measure care, also because of Bob's background in measurement, and we now are working on a manuscript where we would like to introduce case studies, but then in the context of thinking about good care specifically. So it may become a kind of methodological guideline for doing that. So, and I so agree with you that we should not reject systematic approaches to knowing, scientific, or I carry out systematic reviews too, but that they should exist along each other, and that they can also maybe be fruitful together.
Well, going back to Bob's idea about bullying in terms of comparing, I think that's one of the issues that we have with the experimental clinical studies and qualitative and case studies, is that you end up in a position where you have to say, no, I'm better than you are, or you're better than I am. And there's not much of a place for how they fit together without one taking a dominant role and then the other a subordinate role. And can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that's a real cutting edge thing that we need to get a better handle on, about how to do that. Even Lincoln and Guba, for example, go back to saying, well, their kind of approach was, we're better than we are because look at, here's what we're doing. And I know they didn't have that attitude, but there's a little bit of a sense of that competitiveness about who's got the better model.
Well, there's so many things that can be said. Certainly, the comparisons almost always increase the amount of cases that you're working with and reduce the number of variables that you need to pay attention to. So we simplify, hoping to get statistical significance, which essentially doesn't work with large effects, but deals with those that in large numbers can be said to be significant. So we need to find, well, many people have worked on this and they have done it for a long time, this idea of what can you trust for changing your practice in whatever statistical or qualitative language you choose to use. So we've got lots of arguments to back up the idea that you move towards something like embarrassment or bullying in order to make your strongest case, rather than to take a long time practical experience as a major factor in deciding what to base policy and practice on.
Yeah, and I guess maybe I just am not familiar enough with all that literature, but I haven't. Well, I guess can either of you point to some studies where there are a nice beginning integration of how those two pieces get placed together, the experimental models and the case study, qualitative study model?
Well, I can't, in the area of large-scale policy research, such as in pharmacy, but in the practices of supporting educational innovation, there's quite a bit of case study work or comprehensive study of practices where there just isn't any strong interest in a single critical variable deciding whether it's worth further support or further trying out or not. So I'm ducking your question with regard to the examples, but the best case study research or the best policy research that I've ever done is a large national case of under the Nixon administration, where Cities in Schools was a compilation of social services that could be delivered through the schools, rather than through medical or health organizations. I did a qualitative
survey or case study?
No, it's the evaluation of evaluation.
Meta evaluation?
That's what I'm trying to say. A meta-evaluation study. So I was evaluating what the evaluator's doing in this national study, and I did it in a both case study and qualitative way primarily, but I had to use the data that the evaluators were using, which was primarily quantitative and inadequate. So maybe I shouldn't consider it an example of how the quantitative was used well.
No, that's yeah. Well, I'll have to look at it because that's a really interesting example, and it is quite fascinating about what kind of things Nixon administration got involved in terms of some of those projects. We sort of at the beginning of my career, one of the things I did was help to write and initiate a program for youth at risk, and we did develop some summer programs for doing that try to include all kinds of elements of that caring and valuing and those kinds of issues into extended 3-week summer program that we housed at a university to try to get them into a new environment where they were not judged, etc. And so that's a fascinating connection back to the administration, Nixon administration for me. Well, jeepers, we have, I think, just touched the tip of a lot of icebergs here that are, and I hope I didn't dominate the discussion too much. I wanted to do that as a interview. I think I've talked too much, but anyway, this has been very helpful and interesting, and hopefully I have this recorded now, and I hope this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation with all kinds of folks. And so thank
We
you.
hope.
I hope so too, Mort. Wonderful that you're
Yeah,
doing.
okay. Now I think if I push end now, I think it'll say it's going to record. So let's hope this worked. Thank you again. Thank you very much. This was just so enriching for me. So thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Okay.